There we go. It should be on. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm the CEO of the City Club of Cleveland, and I'm very pleased to introduce this panel today, a collection of civic leaders from different sectors. Public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, who have all been working together to implement universal preschool for all students in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District and more broadly in Cuyahoga County. There's a lot of science discussing the positive effects preschool has on school readiness, on literacy rates, and even on workforce development. The gathering of people on our stage today are far more qualified to talk about the brain chemistry of all of that than I am. There's also a lot of information out there for the business case for universal pre-K. Oftentimes, this conversation ends up as a political debate. There are competing studies, some that show that the investment in universal pre-kindergarten programs have a long-term return, others that argue there's no evidence of that return. We have panelists who will cover that as well. Lastly, there's always a concern about the quality of educational services provided to children and families. And there are a range of services available to families in Cuyahoga County, from the highest quality offerings with experiential education and exposure to multiple languages and engagement with the arts, to programs that, on the face of them, may fall closer to daycare than education. I expect we would all agree that publicly funded early childhood education ought to be the very best we can afford. But saying that and providing that are vastly different enterprises. To lead our conversation today is Cindy Oser. She's a Senior Policy Analyst Director for 0 to 3, which is a nonpartisan research-based early childhood resource for policymakers. It's based in Washington, D.C., but like many people, she lives in Cleveland and works in the world. I'll turn it over to Cindy to introduce our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, Cindy Oser.
Thank you, Dan. It's really an honor for me to be here at the City Club today and to be moderating this panel on making a high-quality preschool a community imperative. Except for snack time, it's difficult to rally parents, scientists, business leaders, school leaders, and advocates around the same table on serious issues. But Cleveland has rallied around an issue, and that issue is preschool. And specifically, we're going to be talking about high-quality preschool and how to get more children in Cleveland to benefit from it. As many of you know, without the solid foundation that strong families, good health, and positive early learning experiences provide, children will not be successful in school, and their adult productivity and their physical health, as well as their mental health, will suffer. There's clear evidence that early childhood education can have both immediate and long-term impact. Other cities in the United States recognize the problem and the solution. Leadership right now in Denver, in Seattle, in San Antonio, and in New York City are launching preschool initiatives. So today we're going to talk about Pre for CLE, which is the Cleveland Metropolitan School District program to expand access to high-quality pre-kindergarten, first for 4-year-olds and eventually for 3-year-olds as well. So our panel includes representatives from finance, business, government, public schools, and philanthropy. So I'm going to introduce them and then we'll get to the conversation. So on my immediate left is Barry Doggett, and if I can get my paper here. Barry is the Vice President of Public and Community Affairs for the Eaton Corporation, and Eaton is a global $22 billion diversified power management company. They've got over 102,000 employees and product sales in more than 175 countries. Previously, Barry Doggett was Deputy Director of Cleveland Tomorrow, and he worked there with the business community to support a series of initiatives in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. Next is Rebekah Dorman, who is the Director of Invest in Children and the Cuyahoga County Office of Early Childhood. She's a developmental psychologist by trade, an appointed member of Ohio's Early Childhood Advisory Council, and she chairs the Promise Neighborhood Academics Committee. She was a member of the Pre for CLE work group and is also a proud member of Leadership Cleveland's class of 2011. Next up, Marcia Egbert. Marcia is the Senior Program Officer for Human Services at the George Gund Foundation here in Cleveland, where funding policy work and promoting healthy development, as well as high-quality learning opportunities for young children is a priority. Marcia served as co-chair of the Pre-for-CLE task force along with Eric Gordon, and was the founding chair of the Governor's Early Childhood Advisory Council. She also helped launch Groundwork, which is Ohio's statewide early learning and development advocacy campaign. Eric Gordon, as you know, is the Chief Executive Officer for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and he served as co-chair of the Cleveland Pre-K Task Force. Under his leadership, the school district has significantly expanded high-performing school options. In his first year, he teamed with Mayor Frank Jackson and a coalition of citizens to pass the Cleveland Plan legislation. Recently, voters approved a levy to fund the plan, and its implementation strategy is fully underway. And finally, we have Mark Sniderman. Mark is an economist who spent over 3 decades working at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, rising to the position of Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. It's important to note that Mark just left the bank last month to begin phase 2 of his working life. Beginning this summer, Mark will be returning to Case Western Reserve University as an executive in residence at the Weatherhead School of Business. So that is our esteemed panel, but let's get the conversation started. So I want to start by asking, and I think I'll direct this to Rebekah. Cleveland is recognized locally and in the state and actually across the nation as a leader in its work in early childhood. What investments are already in place for young children and families in Cleveland?
Okay, thank you, Cindy, and thanks very much to the City Club for hosting this wonderful event, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and early childhood advocates out here on a Tuesday. I wanted to do a little history, to go back 15 years when the brain research was just emerging, and those pictures of brains were starting to appear on magazine covers. To our great credit, I think city, county, public and private leaders here really saw the emerging brain research as a call to action, not just something academic to read about. And Invest in Children was created as that call to action, as a way to bring resources, awareness, advocacy around early childhood and create an early childhood system here. So from the beginning, that public-private partnership has had public funding from the county and private funding from many, many foundations supporting our work. And from the beginning, improving the quality of early care and education was absolutely central to the work of Invest in Children, really a cornerstone. With Starting Point, which is our local child care resource and referral agency, leading the way under the Invest in Children umbrella, a lot of very innovative programs were created working towards improving quality. All of that really laid the foundation when in 2005, 2006, the state conversation turned to creating universal pre-kindergarten in the state. Well, you know, Cuyahoga County, we don't wait. We decided we were going to forge ahead. And it was at that point that Invest in Children said, we're going to create a pilot program, building on the work that had come before, starting in 1999, all the good work that had been done, and all the lessons we'd learned to create universal pre-K in Cleveland. And the hallmarks, really, of our program are high-quality care that's affordable for family. Both are really important, high quality and affordability and accessibility. And so I am just delighted here that we're here today to talk about what's going to be the next phase, which is, I think, adjoining with Pre-for-CLE. But just to say a word about where are we with our universal pre-kindergarten program. So publicly funded by our HHS levy, thank you very much. Probably most of you are investors in UPK. Also the Gund Foundation and PNC Bank and the Cleveland Foundation for our evaluation work, which happens with our team at Case Western Reserve. So currently we have 1,600 children in high-quality sites throughout the county. We build on the early childhood system that's here, which is a mixed delivery model of public preschools, private preschools, Head Starts, and family child care homes. 1,600 kids, 90 classrooms, 32 sites. High quality tuition assistance for families so that they're able to afford the program. Family engagement is a key piece of the program, as is accountability. So that means making sure that quality is happening in the sites as we think it's happening, and that there are, of course, outcomes for kids. That's what it's all about. So I'll quickly summarize what we know based on the research done by our partners at the Poverty Center. So first, we know that investing with resources, training, and technical assistance does improve quality. That was documented by an individual monitoring tool, and we know that quality does increase when you put resources into good child care sites. So we take them from good to outstanding. The second thing that we know is that the most disadvantaged children coming into the program, the ones scoring lowest on school readiness measures, they make the biggest gains, and that's a well-documented fact throughout the literature, and our local data supports that. I think the last thing that we learned is what happens with performance on the kindergarten readiness assessment. What we know is that children who come out of UPK enter the Cleveland schools scoring at about 3 points higher on average than children who are entering from the general population. So is 3 points important, you might ask? Well, again, based on local data, we know for every point higher you score on the crawl, you have an 11% greater chance of passing the third grade reading assessment. So, boy, it really matters. So we're very proud of the work we've done. We're really excited about partnering with Pre4Cle and really totally moving towards universality as not just an aspiration, but a reality.
Okay, good. All right, well, I want to move from what's been happening to what's going to be happening. The Pre4Cle effort has a pretty significant financial commitment to go along with it. So Mark Sniderman, I'm going to look to you to talk to us about what kind of return on that investment we might be able to expect.
Thanks, Cindy, and I'd like to also thank the City Club for the opportunity to appear today. Well, I'm going to pick up where Rebekah left off. She talked about, she began with brain research and all of that development, and that's just another example of how we understand that people who've worked with children in early learning environments for a long time have understood that enriched experiences are really going to promote the type of development that we're looking for. Well, economists have started to get interested in these early learning opportunities as well. And the interest that economists have in this are twofold. One is to try to evaluate the effectiveness of programs, and secondly, to measure the rate of return. So we have some, fortunately, longitudinal data from some preschool programs that have been around actually since the 60s, and then increasingly, as more and more communities develop preschool programs, we're able to collect more and more data. So I imagine that over the coming years we'll have even greater opportunities to study the effectiveness of programs and learn more about effective program design. But what have we learned so far? Well, there are a lot of people who've written about this. Probably the most well-known is James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics. James Heckman was a giant in the field of economics in terms of measuring returns to education well before he actually got interested in early learning, but he did begin to take an interest in this, and he's become very widely known and a very strong advocate for promoting the rate of return to high-quality pre-K programs. So what have Heckman and his colleagues found? Well, they have found that these high-quality programs can actually yield a return on par with what you can get by investing in the U.S. stock market over time. That is a 7 to 10% annual rate of return in real terms after adjusting for inflation. So this is actually a very high rate of return, and it encourages us, in fact, it really requires us to consider investing in human capital with the same purposefulness and thoughtfulness as we invest in physical capital. And we ought to be looking at investments in early childhood learning and development with the same eye that we do the other kinds of investments that we undertake in society. In fact, Heckman and others point out that the types of returns that I've mentioned are really on a par with, and in fact often greatly exceed, other kinds of investments that you can get with public dollars. So in our community and in many other communities, there are always conversations about roads and bridges and sports complexes and not even just the physical capital kinds of investments, but investments in workforce development and other kinds of training programs. We should be putting investments in early childhood learning on the table at the same time and actually feel quite confident that it's likely that we're going to be able to get rates of return on investments in these kinds of programs that are at least as good, if not better, than we get in many, many other uses of our public funds. So that's, in a nutshell, what we're learning. And I would say, interestingly, one of the things that Heckman likes to point out in his work is that these gains come not just from cognitive development, but in fact non-cognitive skill development as well. In fact, the non-cognitive development may be actually somewhat more important than the cognitive skill development because it's the development of certain types of behaviors in early childhood that actually yield tremendous benefits over an individual's lifetime. It leads them to participate as citizens in a much more active way, in a healthy way, than would otherwise be the case.
And Mark, what do you mean by non-cognitive skills? Can you tell us a little bit more about what those are?
These are, the ability to interact and relate more effectively with other children and with adults. And it's connected to, later on in life, reduced juvenile delinquency, reduced adult crime, perhaps less need even within the school system for remediation, makes for better classroom management, more effectiveness for classroom teaching. So there's a lot of behavioral attitudes, and we shouldn't forget health behaviors, use of tobacco, other kinds of activities over a person's lifetime are associated with healthier child development in the non-cognitive area.
Terrific. Well, I know the early childhood community was thrilled when the economists started to look at early childhood as an investment from the economic perspective. We were a little bit puzzled, I think, at first when the business community started coming on board. Barry Doggett, can you talk to us about why your colleagues in the business world might be interested in early childhood?
Mark just gave you the answer.
Okay, never mind.
Sorry, Barry.
It's not, we're looking for returns on investment. I mean, seriously, we are always looking for places to invest our money where we're going to get a good return. And I think certainly all the things that Mark talked about are exactly why we're doing it. But it's not just about the bottom line, although that is hugely important to companies. I think another thing is if you go on, we have a website called eatonjobs.com. And so if you go on to eatonjobs.com and you put in Cleveland as the location, you will see a very long and extensive list of job openings. We have 6 major employment centers here in Northeast Ohio, and in most all of those, there are a large number of jobs that are open right now. And we need a qualified workforce to be able to fill those jobs. Because frankly, especially a lot of the jobs that are in our manufacturing facilities, when we look at them right now, we have a real struggle to fill those jobs. And unfortunately, a lot of those jobs are right now filled by people like me that are aging out of the workforce, that have been around for a long time and are about to retire and, like Mark, to look for the next chapter in our lives. And so what that means is we've got to have a pretty robust pipeline of skilled workers to come in behind them. And that pipeline starts at birth. And I think that's the indication you've heard from both Mark and Rebekah so far, is that we've got to start there and really start to build that pipeline so that these kids can come through the pipeline and then get the jobs that we need. The third reason, and the business community likes to deal in threes for some reason, but the third reason why we're supportive of this is it's about our employees. More and more of our employees are, fortunately for us, women who are leaving their children someplace other than at the office, and they need to be confident about their ability to do that. And so they need high-quality child care to be able to feel like they can come in and work in the office and get their jobs done and not have to worry about where their children are. And so I think the ability to have high-quality early childhood education for their children is something that puts their minds at ease and makes them more comfortable and better equipped to do their jobs. So those are just three reasons why I think the business community feels like this is the right investment to be making.
Great, thank you. So I now want to move to some of the nuts and bolts of the plan, and I'm going to ask Eric to talk about how high-quality preschool fits into the Cleveland plan to transform and improve the Cleveland metropolitan schools.
So Rebekah took my answer, so we're we've got a theme here. You know, I'm going to start where Rebekah brought us, because we know in education that there's an achievement gap. But we actually know also that that achievement gap is very largely, and some would say almost exclusively, informed by an opportunity gap. We know that up to 50% of the difference between a child entering my kindergarten and a child entering a typical suburban community kindergarten is attributed to the difference in achievement, that my children often come with a lot less exposure to vocabulary, a lot less exposure to social and emotional learnings, which is what we call the non-cognitive skills in the education arena, and we also know, and Rebekah pointed this out, that those that actually start the furthest behind are eager to gain and rapidly catch up. This is the sponge moment. That's what the brain research really showed us, is this is the sponge moment. And you know it, you see it if you are around little children, you see it when they start calling everything a dog because they've learned dog, and so the cat's a dog and the dog's a dog and everything's a dog. And then they assimilate and say, oh, that dog's called a cat. And I mean, it's just this time of creation. And so they have two words, right? Dog and cat. And then they figure out that the big cat is called cat and the little cat's called puppy because they haven't, you know. But it is an important generation of knowledge time that is lost for young children if we don't actively, specifically engage. We know third grade reading is critically important as a tip point because that's when children should be functionally literate and move from learning to read to reading to learn. And so Rebekah mentioned that for every point we can increase on kindergarten readiness, there's an 11% more likelihood that that child will be third grade literate. That's 33% when you think of the 3 points that already happens in our existing early childhood. The challenge is that more than half of the children coming into our kindergarten program don't have those opportunities, and that we have to fill those. And so when we designed the Cleveland plan really did start with an end in mind. So Mayor Jackson, even before the Cleveland plan was on paper, challenged us to put a higher education compact together that said, if the district gets children ready, make sure they have access to and can complete some kind of secondary degree, a 2-year college, 4-year college, technical certificate or something. He then challenged us to say, so what are you going to do in the middle? What's K to 12 got to do? And so we have the Transformation Alliance overseeing now this community commitment to K through 12 and getting kids into better seats more quickly. But then the last piece of that is, how do we close that gap so that our teachers, our educators can bring kids successfully through K-12 and ensure that they access a high-quality post-secondary experience. So it's written right into the Cleveland plan as one of the 6 elements that every child should expect. And it's something that I'm really excited has moved forward with the help of so many colleagues in this room. You know, there are those who would say, you know, of all the things you must do, why would you do something that you don't have to? You know, preschool is actually not part of Ohio's K-12 system. I would argue that the evidence is just so strikingly clear. The economic evidence, the academic evidence, that if we don't just fundamentally address this challenge in our community, we cannot expect our educators then to recoup everything that other children have had in their 3- and 4-year-old experience.
Great. And that plan being part of a continuum, starting with very young children and going all the way up through elementary and secondary education, addresses one of the criticisms, which is, that fade out. And so I think Cleveland probably has a leg up on some of the other initiatives that are starting and stopping with the preschool experience.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I know we have a lot to talk about, but I would say that, there is a legitimate criticism about preschool and then the potential fade out. Really, that is looking at a K-12 system that recognizes that there better be booster shots. When you get your first inoculation, that's not it. You're not well, right? You actually then have to have effective booster shots in your educational experience. The other half of the achievement gap is largely attributed to long summer legs without education. And what can we do to close the rest of that opportunity gap so that my educators sitting in this room can take that time that they have to accelerate kids instead of always spending that time trying to recuperate.
Great. Okay. Yes.
Cindy, if we're successful, we'll be able to prevent Marcia from having to say anything. So, because we've all been, that's a worthy goal. But since the fade out came up, and Eric addressed it, I wanted to make one other point before it gets lost, which is that, again. We don't have a lot of evidence, that is, meaning on millions of children well into their adulthood, because the longitudinal studies would have had to have begun back in the 60s to have that. We have a few of those studies, but not a lot. But the few studies that we have show that while there is some evidence that these short-term gains in things like IQ or some of those kinds of things do fade out, these behaviors that I talked about earlier, those changes in behavior persist over the lifetime. And so the kinds of returns that I was talking about from reduced crime and delinquency and better health behaviors and all of that accrue to people over their lifetimes, there is evidence that those persist even when some of these short-term measurement things that are called fade out can be detected. So I think we want to bear that in mind when this issue comes up as well.
That's right. And I think that some of the newer research on the effects of adverse childhood experiences on later physical health is an amazing set of research that we've just begun to realize its potential. So Marcia, I know that we are all exercising our non-cognitive skills in confidence and curiosity and perseverance, but I do have a question for you. I'm not an educator, and I know as co-chair of this task force, you really got into the weeds on designing this preschool approach. But one question was always at the front of my mind, and that is, why is quality important? So if you can talk to us just a little bit about why quality is important in this effort.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cindy, and thanks to the City Club. It's thrilling to be here on this topic in particular. I think the first thing I would say about why quality matters is that every child matters, and every child deserves the best. And when you think about it, what we would want for our own individual children, what we're saying through these efforts, be it Invest in Children or Pre-for-CLE, is that every child in this community deserves that same standard of care and concern that we would bring to our own family, and that it shouldn't be limited to just those children that are fortunate enough to be born into the right circumstances that allow that to happen fairly organically. But quality really has evolved over the last number of years, as we've seen, as Rebekah started to talk about and others mentioned, as the field of early childhood has evolved over the last number of decades from really what Mark and Eric mentioned as sort of a work support for families that needed, and very understandably so, needed a place to have children while they pursued employment. We've really evolved to a place where, yes, that work support is still very important, but we know now, and this is due so much to the neuroscience research, that it really needs to be a child-focused set of opportunities. And so what quality has wound up meaning, or come to mean, over the last number of years is really this shift away from safety, which is critically important to maintain, but really, what can we do to help fully develop to the best capacity each and every childhood, or each and every child? And so that started to take on really critical elements that we can identify and invest in, like the highest quality teachers and teacher assistants. And so the professionals in the setting matter, and their training and support and development matters. So high quality programs have invested a great deal in the professional development of the care providers and teachers. We also know that it means that you should be using a curriculum for the day that's really grounded in research and evidence. And it's funny, when you talk to folks that aren't as familiar with the world of early learning, it can sound like we're talking about putting 3-year-olds in rows of desks. And nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. For when you walk in to a truly high quality setting, like we're fortunate to have so many of in this community, what you see is amazing learning happening through play, since that's how we know children really do learn best. And so it's embedding the elements of social development, emotional development, physical development, as well as cognitive development, of course, in the spirit of play, and doing that through a careful and defined and researched curriculum. It's also about a great physical space. So whether it's inside the setting or having great outdoor space for children, the physical environment, just like it does in our home, the physical environment matters. And so a lot of what quality standards have been developed really focus on that, that physical space. It's been incredibly encouraging to see this drive and commitment towards high quality start to be reflected at every level of government that invests in young children. So in the federal budget that was just passed a few weeks ago, one of the very few bipartisan pieces that emerged from that budget with new investment were exciting investments in early learning, and they were all focused on high quality, whether it was around Head Start or early Head Start, or what is being called developmental pre-K, which is exactly what we're building here in Greater Cleveland. At the state level, we've seen the state completely embrace what's called Step Up to Quality, the consumer rating system. Hopefully you've seen around town the banners hanging outside of great centers, whether it's a 3-star or 4-star or 5-star center. Each of those stars comes with certain quality indicators that can be known to consumers and help parents choose good settings. And then, of course, at the local level, this really remarkable commitment from both the county and city and school district levels in embracing these quality standards.
Well, very good. Those were my questions, but we're going to make a transition so that we can hear from all of you. So get your questions ready, and Dan's going to help us with that transition.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a special forum panel conversation on universal preschool across Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. We'll return to our speakers momentarily for our traditional City Club question and answer period, and we encourage you all to formulate your questions now and remind you that they should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us through our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, 104.9 WCLV, and WVIZ PBS Idea Stream, or on one of the many other radio stations across the country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Today's program is part of the Education Innovation Series, sponsored by a generous grant from the Nordson Corporation Foundation. Thank you very much for your support. The next event in that series is on April 4th, a conversation with David Kerp, author of Improbable Scholars, The Rebirth of a Great American School System and a Strategy for America's Schools. That book is about the remarkable turnaround in Union City, New Jersey, where universal pre-K, incidentally, was instituted 25 years ago. Today we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Centers for Families and Children, the Children's Museum, Cleveland Teachers Union, the Educational Services Center of Cuyahoga County, the George Gund Foundation, the Literacy Cooperative, Ohio Guidestone, PNC Bank, and the Positive Education Program. Thank you all so much for your generous support. Now we'll return to our enormous panel for your questions. We welcome questions from all of you, guests and members alike. Holding the microphones today are our program director, Carrie Miller, and our development associate, Mike Grimaldi. First question, please.
Good afternoon. This is such an important topic, and I'm so happy that Rebekah made it happen. But I'd like to say, first of all, the research has shown that one of the major differences between lower income families and higher income families is the ability of the parent to actually work with the child. For example, sitting them in front of the TV to watch Sesame Street as opposed to actually talking to the child about Sesame Street. So my question is, talk about the parent education piece. What has been put in place to make sure that our parents know how to continue the work that goes on in the preschool?
Do you want me to start? Okay. Well, thanks, Meryl, for that question, and it gives me a chance to talk a little bit about some of the other wonderful programs of Invest in Children. So our continuum starts at the prenatal period, and we have a number of home visiting programs. Parents as Teachers is the one I'm going to talk about, which it sort of speaks for itself with the title, that believes parents are the first and best teachers of their children. And again, we have both the state version of that with state funding as well as a county version of that program. So that's one of the programs. Moms First is another home visiting program. Spark is another home visiting program that are all working. I think it's all working in tandem with the handoff coming at preschool and then at kindergarten. And you might want to say something about how family engagement is going to work with Pre-for-Cle.
First, we were really thrilled that over 300 parents and families participated in the Cleveland Pre-K Task Force outreach for town halls, surveys, etc. And it was wonderful to get incredibly rich feedback from so many parents from every quadrant of the city. And part of what we learned was that there really is a need for help in navigation, like anything else. It's a complicated system, and to find your way to just the right place for your child takes some support and assistance. And so we have built into the plan family navigators that will help families really decide what's the best option for them and how to find it, both from a transportation and a affordability standpoint. And that's critical. Another thing that we learned was that it's great to get a child to the right front door, but a family, you want to keep that family engaged throughout the time of the entire preschool experience. And so we've looked at also including what we're calling resource navigators into the Pre-for-Cle, which will really help families find all of the kinds of community supports that Rebekah's referenced and that we're fortunate to have available. But again, you can't find what you don't know about. And so you really do, we do want to make sure that families are getting that kind of support and assistance through through resource navigators. And then last but not least, I'll say one really exciting piece of this, of the Pre-for-Cle plan, is to create a new smartphone app, because if there's anything we know, it's that the ubiquitous technology that exists in almost every family now, or close to that, is having access to a cell phone and in many cases a smartphone. And so we really want to build off the trust and friendliness that that instrument has, and use it as a way to connect people to resources in their own neighborhoods and in their broader community, and for prompts around everything from immunizations to curriculum support. So we think it's an exciting element of the plan.
Thank you for building and presenting to us a pre-K plan. My question relates to trying to quantify the need a little bit, not only in the city of Cleveland, but in the county, and if you want to go there, the state. I read, I think there's 5,400 children in Cleveland that would qualify. I assume that's fourth grade only, from what I've read so far. Four-year-old, excuse me. And the cost is about $10,000. But if we roll that out to the year 3, and we roll that out to the county, where do we quantify the need, and how do we determine how many children are going to have to qualify because they're disadvantaged educationally or economically and need the help?
Yeah, I don't know
Take
so much
the city
about
part, or?
You start with the county.
city and county.
So,
We all have an opinion on this. And oh, by the way, thank you to the City Club.
So I'll start with the county perspective. So right now, our UPK program, about half of those slots of the 1,600 kids are in the city, and another 800 are in the rest of the county. So I'll talk about the rest of the county because I'll let the pre-for-CLE people talk about what's going on. So probably, and again, our program is 3 to 5-year-olds, so it's a bigger universe. So we have, say, 800 kids now. The need we estimate is probably more like 14,000 kids in the rest of the county, with about a 70% uptake is what the estimate would be out of that universe. How much would that cost? It would cost many, many millions of dollars. Is it worth it? Absolutely. But we don't have a per child cost with universal pre-K, and that always drives everyone crazy. But it's a very customized funding formula, which goes based on what the resources of the program are and what the gap is in reaching high quality based on a national study, and then what the particular tuition assistance needs are of those kids. But if you wanted me to throw out a number, probably 50 million.
So I would just say, Rebekah talked about the rest of the county. The city, in many ways, is a mirror of the rest of the county. So we tend to see about half of the need directly in the city of Cleveland and about half of the need indirectly then reflected in the rest of the county. We know from our study that there are about 16,000 children in the 3 and 4-year-old category. We know that as of today, there are about 2,800 high-quality seats. So the gap is pretty large. Even if we get a take-up rate of about 11,000 or about 70%, which is what we've seen nationally in the early startups, and we intend to be way beyond that when we're at our very best, we have a long way to go to get to 3 and 4-year-olds. The good part is there are lots of opportunities for us to rapidly expand and to take advantage of resources that already exist in the community. So the price tag is large, without a doubt, and the investment is proven, and so we have to keep in mind the return on investment. But even before we get there, there are things we can do. And so the district's commitment, our board will actually vote tonight to endorse the plan. They've had this on the agenda to read and plan to endorse. The district's commitment is to expand our current classrooms so that more children can access high quality. And you know, while there's certainly a price tag to that, it's not an exorbitant price tag. And we can do that to expand about 200 full-day seats, a little bit more than 200 full-day seats, and about 50 to 75 half-day seats in a year. And so that's a pretty large jump in a single year. We're also all going through an aggressive rating system that Marcia mentioned, the Step Up to Quality. There are a number of agencies out there that aren't rated. That doesn't mean that they're poorly rated. It means that we don't know. And so it may be that they're actually very good performers and that those kids also are in good seats. And so there's lots of strategies to take existing resources and to apply it to this problem as well.
Thank you for coming to the City Club. How will you measure your success in 5 years? What will success look like if you have achieved what you hope to?
Great, thank you for that question. And I can assure you it was a topic of intense dialogue and much iteration in terms of getting to a point. And let me just say, first of all, that it wasn't a given. We've seen other community plans that don't really have very clear benchmarks, but I think it's safe to say that we went into this process from the get-go believing that it was absolutely essential that there be very clear benchmarks associated with pre-for-CLE, not only because we want that for children, but we all felt a very keen responsibility around public accountability with both Cleveland Metropolitan School District levy funds as a part of the mix and County Health and Human Services levy funds a part of this mix. So we went through a process that determined we really needed 2 different levels of benchmarks. One at the child level so that we could measure how actually individual children were performing throughout their experience in pre-K and going into kindergarten. And then also what I think we would characterize more as sort of system level benchmarks. And so the child level benchmarks are tied toward what we alluded to earlier. There are gains in those assessments that are being put in place at the state level. So a multidimensional assessment. It's not a test. I want to be really clear. We are not testing 4-year-olds. It is a developmental assessment that really takes into account all of the domains that we talked about. So we'll be looking at progress there relative to the county average. So are the children going through this process really improving and closing that gap that Eric referenced and able to achieve at the median level? And then also at the system level, our goal is to have 2,000 additional children in high quality seats in 2016. It's an ambitious goal, and to ensure that we have spread the pre-for-CLE opportunity to the highest need neighborhoods, most particularly by 2018. And so we feel that we're ready to hold ourselves accountable to some very clear outcomes, and that if we're able to meet them, it will just be a remarkable gain in short order for the children that we're hoping to bring into the program.
Let me just offer 2 quick little pieces. One, and I just don't think it can be said clearly enough, the expected outcome is that children enter kindergarten ready, nothing less. And so we can measure that at a large level by the percentage of kids who are closing the gap against the county average and then the state average. But our outcome is that a child enters ready for kindergarten. Then behind that, and so the statistics behind that are measuring that closing the gap. Behind that is the seats matter, because when we compare CMSD classrooms to non-CMSD, and that does not mean there are not quality outside of CMSD and that everything is perfect, but it is a measurable that we're able to do because of our agency. We know that 13% fewer children score in the lowest band if they've had our early learning program, and 13% more children score in the highest band. So you can presume we've essentially lifted the entire group 13%. So those 2,000 additional seats that are like us and other high-quality partners have huge impact at readiness, which gives us a high expectation that while the goals sound very rigorous, they're also actually attainable.
I'm very glad you're having this topic and your very ambitious plan. Last Friday night, PBS Evening News offered a report from the Civil Rights Office, U.S. Department of Education, on the depth of the disparities for African American children. And one of the issues that they focused on so much was suspensions for 4 and 5-year-olds. This tells me the teachers do not understand brain development and the root causes of behavioral issues. I'm asking, is your plan include professional staff development that includes brain development and the critical losses that result from a lack of attachment and early insecurities?
So the short answer is yes. There's a great deal of professional development, professional training, professional support for all of the educators that would serve our 3 and 4-year-olds, whether they are CMSD district educators or whether they are high-quality provider educators. And we've also talked a great deal about the necessity of evening the bar so that early childhood education, whether it's within a public school district or within private or county-supported agencies, is treated with high respect and respect through resources, through salary and benefits and things that make it attractive. To the issue of the Civil Rights Report, it is really striking. And I would also tell you, it really talks to us about social policy, because there are often teachers who have no choice under very harsh policies about the kinds of behaviors that must come with them, suspendable kinds of requirements that feed into that report. And it's disparate in black and brown communities and in communities of poverty because, again, going to the earlier question about the lack of attention to social and emotional readiness and resources and supports, that means children show up more likely to demonstrate some of those behaviors than some of their peers do, and putting our educators then into the position that they have no choice but to respond to some pretty harsh consequences for children that fortunately our state is finally starting to wrestle with and really move away from. So it's a complex issue, really an important report that can inform not only early childhood but our entire educational system.
Thank you for being here. I have a question as an ex-first grade teacher. I've had kindergartners who've come and said they know their ABCs, let's say, but they really don't. So my question has to do with how's the coordination looking from from preschool to kindergarten to first grade and so forth, especially when we're talking about, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but the core curriculum.
I'll take the first stab at it because I had the pleasure of co-chairing the transition work group as part of Pre for CLE. So we were acutely aware that this passing of the baton, the handoff, so to speak, of leaving the early childhood system and entering kindergarten sometimes doesn't always go smoothly. And that includes for the teacher, for the parent, and for the child. So we have a very intentional plan there with early childhood leadership teams in each of the schools that are going to really be focused on how to work with the preschool sites that are feeding into that particular school building to make that a smooth transition for everyone. And I don't know if you want to say more about that. I mean, there's obviously more to come and more details to be worked out, but I think we recognize it's going to be a building by building plan, and that you really have to let the folks in that particular neighborhood and community figure out how to make the transition work most smoothly. But there's a very significant focus on looking at that transition and recognizing it. Also, getting families to register on time, as we say. So March into kindergarten, we're in the last few days of that. Now is the time families should be registering for kindergarten and not after school started. So Invest in Children and many partners in the room are leading this campaign. So just even that would be a big step forward and something that we're measuring, but I'll let you guys. Do you have more to say on that?
Go ahead.
There's a genuine commitment inside the district for an even increased level of attention to transition coordination, which is really encouraging. There's been a lot of good work that's been done to date, but through the Cleveland Pre-K Task Force, there's an even greater commitment that's being made around that transition coordination. And so it has been absolutely a critical part of the dialogue since the very first meeting of the task force, and it's reflected throughout the plan as being essential to its success.
I'm going to ask the question from a Montessori standpoint on continuity and transition. And that lady took my question, so my angle will be a little different. But it's very real, and I want to point that out because the law looks at these segments, pre-K, K, first grade, as distinct. And the lottery, in many cases, is placed in front of kindergarten. I don't know if that's true in the public sector, but it is true in the district, but it's very true with the charter schools. So my question is, we're trying to change the law, because I don't think until you change the law can you get rid of these segmented limitations, transitioning from pre-K to K and from K to first grade. And I think you'll admit, Cindy, I think that the research tells us that the continuity, which is a word you and Rebekah both used several times, the continuity of curriculum and the connect between pre-K, K, and first grade is the essential ingredient for early childhood success. What do you have to say about this, and what can we do about it?
Well, I'll definitely agree on the continuity part. That, one of the things we know about children that is often contrary to our policies is that they are learning continuously, that learning builds on what's come before, and it's very important for what comes after to recognize what's come before. So from that perspective, continuity is critically important, and we've got a plan for that in our system. That said, our policies don't always match that. And that's why we have people like me working on the policy side to try to craft policy that fits what we know from science and everyday experience. So how will that be addressed? Is there something specific in the plan that will address that transition?
So I would say, the policy matters a great deal. Public understanding of modern ways of thinking about education is going to be critical here too, because we all grew up thinking about kindergarten discretely and separately from first grade, discretely and separately from early childhood or preschool or what have you. And we as educators and leaders have actually taught teachers to think of it differently. And so when we find ourselves in the case of what we call a split, where there are 2 grades together, we think of that as a bad decision instead of empowering teachers to take the right kids who are developmentally appropriate for being together, regardless of if they happen to fall in bucket 1 or bucket 2, and work with them. And that's an organizational behavior challenge that we need to rethink. So, so we can, and we are. And so we have just in the district this year, just started to empower teams, and we're at the very, very beginning of it, which comes with the angst of doing so, to really rethink things like looping and rethink things like, thinking of splits in more natural and effective ways, which in fact goes on in some of our buildings because they just don't tell management, right? So teachers already know how to do it when we let them, right? And so we have to free up the old-fashioned, constructs and languages and work around some policy to be able to do it. But it's starting to happen already. We're already seeing educators doing that. We see it in our public Montessoris with preschool K and 1 together, because that's the foundation in Montessori. But we see it in other schools too, where early childhood classrooms regroup children based on where they are in reading compared to where they are in numeracy and things of that nature. So it really means empowering our educators to have the opportunity to think outside of the scaffold that we have laid upon education. And just one other thing I think we have to say with it is it really gets then at this fundamentally flawed argument of the 3rd grade guarantee. So yes, we need to guarantee that children can read at 3rd grade. That they got to read, but you don't guarantee it by saying, and if you don't, you are retained, because we know that the retention literature is equally damaging to not reading. But we haven't changed the construct to say when you arrive in 3rd grade may not be the same time as when everybody else arrived in 3rd grade, because it's not about time, it's about learning. And that there is a bar of achievement that has to be occurring instead of a bar of time that, oops, you're 7.5 years old, and so you either go for it or you don't. And so we have to cause the opportunity to reconstruct how we think about education, and it's beginning.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Thank you, panel. It was very highly informative. I'd like to invite everybody that if you're interested in more information about today's program, you should visit clevelandmetroschools.org/pre4CLE. That's the number 4. Or investinchildren.cuyahogacounty.us. And there's probably a number of other resources you'll find when you get to both of those places. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a special program panel discussion about universal preschool education in Cleveland and across Cuyahoga County. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, panelists. Thank you very much to our moderator. Our forum is now adjourned.